What's going on, my dear friends? Today in this video, let's learn and master the Angular framework's latest version. So let's get started. Alright guys, in this section we are going to dive into the Angular forms. So basically we have two types in Angular. So we'll dive into these two form types from scratch. So let's begin. Alright guys, as usual, before we dive into the Angular forms, we'll look at the traditional form workflow using JavaScript. Then we'll come back to the Angular forms module, so you guys can understand the behind the scenes process efficiently. So guys, first let's create a simple form inside the app component HTML file with these three fields: name, email, and address. Guys, how do we create a form? For this we can use HTML input tags, right? So after that, inside this, first add the input tag and the input type will be text. So after this, add the placeholder and set the placeholder value as name. So this input is for the name field. So next, duplicate this same input field 2 times and change this second input type to email and change the placeholder to email. Next, change the third input's placeholder to address, and that's it. So save this and go to the browser. This is not looking good, so let's make it a little bit more organized. So add 2 BR tags between these inputs. Now again save this and go to the browser. Now this looks okay, but let's take this form center of the browser view so we can see this form clearly. So how do we do that, guys? For this, we'll write a simple CSS code. So wrap this input field inside of a div tags. After this, add a CSS class to this div, something form center. Next, let's write the CSS styles for this. So guys, for this we can use the app component CSS file, right? So we learned about this in detail. Alright, so open the app component CSS file. Inside this, add the CSS style. First add the CSS class, name after this CSS scope. Inside this, first add the margin. So value is 0 and auto. So next, set a width around 250 pixels. So guys, simply this will place the form middle of the page. That's it. So save this all. Guys, let's add a heading to this form, something user form. Add this inside of h2 tags. That's it. So save this all and go to the browser. Now this seems perfect. Guys, don't worry about this look. I'm just preparing this form to continue this lecture. So when we developing the real world application, we'll use the Tailwind CSS to make this form looks more organized way. Alright guys, now we have the form. Now what I want to do is I want to simply capture this form data. So how do we do that? For this, first of all, we need a submit button. So inside the component HTML file, create this button. So the button tags and the button text will be submit. Next, in order to submit this button, we need a form tags. So add that here, open and close forms tags, and place these inputs inside of that forms tags. Perfect. Alright, so guys, now we got our form structure set up correctly. Next step is to capture the data that the user enters into this form. So basically we use a form inside of a website to get the entries from the end user, right? So for this, we want to handle the form submission. So that when the user clicks the submit button, we can capture and process the input data. Now, how do we capture this form data? Can you guys guess? So guys, for this we have to first add the name attributes to these inputs. So let's quickly add them. The first input name value is name, the second one is email, and the last one is address. Now simply add the submit event binding to this form tags. So now we don't need this action attribute, so remove this and add the submit event binding. So how do we do that? Yes, of course. So instead of brackets, add the event which is submit. From this event, call a method something form submit. So after this, simply add the parentheses. So now inside the app component TS file, create this method. The method name is form submit. After this, parentheses and the method scope. Now inside this, simply add a console log something form submitted. Now save this all and go to the browser. Now fill this form and click on the submit button. Look inside the console. We cannot see any logs. Why is that? Can you guys tell me the problem? Guys, if you look at this carefully, when I submit this form, this entire page is reloading. You can find that from this refresh icon, right? And also guys, you guys can see this form also getting reset. So that's why we are not getting this log inside the browser console. So in order to prevent this, we have to add the prevent default method. So for this, first we have to pass this form submission event to the submit method. Pass the $sign event to this method as the parameter. Now inside this, just simply capture this event parameter. So create a variable something event and set this type as any. Now inside this, add this to prevent the default reloading behavior of this form reloading. So this event parameter, after this dot prevent default, follow this simple capital letters, and after this add the parentheses. So guys, simply this will prevent the default reloading when we submit the form. So save this and go to the browser. Now submit this form. As you guys can see here, we got this form submission log. So guys, now using the same event parameter, we can capture the form's values as well. So let's quickly capture the form values. So again, let's add another log. Inside this, add this event.target.name. So which is this name input. So after this, add value. So simply this will return the value of the name input. So save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, we got the name log printed inside the browser console when we submit this form. So guys, using the same approach, we can capture all other input values and we can deal with the data manipulations. So guys, that lesson here is not how to do this using the JavaScript. I wanted to show you guys how really this is painful when we dealing with form submission only using pure JavaScript. So the first problem is that the form is reloading the page by default when we submit it. Because of this, we can't easily handle form validations or work with the form data before the page refresh. This makes it really difficult to build user-friendly forms that can validate input, show error messages, or process data smoothly without reloading the page. Now one of the issue is how we are capturing the form data. We had to manually access each input field using event target and the specific name attribute. This approach works, but it's not very efficient or scalable, especially if we have a lot of form fields. It's easy to make mistakes and the code can quickly become hard to maintain, right? And also guys, imagine if we need to add form validations like checking if the email field is properly formatted or if the name field isn't left empty. Doing all of this in plain JavaScript would involve a lot of manual coding and it would get even more complex as the form grows. So guys, this is where Angular comes in and makes our life much easier. So with the Angular Forms approach, we can work with the forms handling easy and efficient way. So in the next lecture, we'll dive into these Angular Forms approaches in detail. Alright, so that's it for this lecture. Let's move on to the next lecture. Alright guys, so in Angular we have two methods to handle forms. So first one is the template driven forms and the second one is the reactive forms. So in this section we will dive into the Angular template driven forms. So the first question is, what is this template driven form? Can anyone guess? So guys, a template driven form in Angular is way to handling forms where most of the logics and setups are done directly in the template rather than in the components class. So essentially you define the structure validation and data binding of your form direct within the HTML file using Angular's powerful directives. So let's see this in action. Alright guys, first thing first, let's see how we can transform this form into an Angular template driven form. For this, all we have to do here is we have to just simply add the NgForm directive to this forms tags. So it's very simple, right? So inside the forms tags, add this directive NgForm, follow this naming convention, exactly same as this. Now guys, we are getting this compile error saying that NgForm isn't a known element. So in order to prevent this, we have to import this to this app component HTML file. So guys, inside the app component file, inside this imports array, let's add the import. Guys, this NgForm is coming from the Angular's forms module. So import the forms module here. As usual, select this import. This will add the import statement. Perfect. Now as you guys can see here, now there are no errors. So guys, now let's save this all and let's simply reset the forms submit method. And let's add a simple log with form submitted text. So save this and again go to the browser. Click on the submit button. As you guys can see here, we got this log, which means this is working without any problems. Guys, if you can remember, when we submit this form previously, it was reloaded the page, right? So to prevent that, we use the prevent default JavaScript method, right? But as you guys can see here, with this NgForm directive, Angular automatically prevent that default behavior of an HTML form submit. We don't need to write any extra codes for this. So with this NgForm directive, we converted this form into an Angular form. Now this is just a simple regular HTML form. So now using this NgForm, we can do so many things. So we look at them in detail. So guys, the first one here is, now we have to capture the form's values in order to do the data manipulations when user submit this form. So guys, the first one is, now we have to capture the form's values in order to do the data manipulation when user submit this form. So how do we do that? So guys, in the previous we used JavaScript event to capture these form values, right? Now for this Angular form, Angular will automatically capture this with this NgForm directive. Wait, I'll show you this. Let's simply log this NgForm directive. So guys, in order to log this NgForm directive returning values, somehow we have to send this to the app component ES file. Otherwise, we cannot log this inside the template file, right? So in order to send this to the app component ES file, we have to pass this as a parameter for the submit method. But guys, we cannot directly send this to the submit method. So first we have to assign this to a template variable and we can send this back to the submit method, right? So guys, how do we do that? We learned about template variables in detail, right? So hope you guys remember this. So we define a template variable using the hash tag. So add a hash symbol. After this, define a variable name something f and assign this to this NgForm directive. And at last, don't forget to put this NgForm directive inside of quotes. Perfect. So now guys, simply this template variable will capture what this NgForm will return. So now we can simply send this to the component ES file as a parameter for this submit method. And now guys, remove this previous event. We no longer need that. Now pass the template variable, which is this f. That's it. So now inside the app component ES file, now we are capturing the value with this event parameter variable. So now simply log this parameter variable inside this form submit method. Console.log inside parentheses pass the variable name event. That's it. So save this all and go to the browser. Click on the submit button. As you guys can see here, we got this massive object with so many details. So what's going on here? Well, we'll cover this in the next lecture. Alright guys, in Angular when we working with forms, there are two important classes that we have to consider, FormGroup and the FormControl classes. So we use the FormGroup class to represent the entire form, and we apply the FormControl class to each individual input field within that form. For example, consider our user details form. The entire form is managed by a form group, and each input field such as name, email and address uses the FormControl class, right? So we can have multiple instances of form control within a single form group. Additionally, we can also have multiple form group instances within an Angular application. For example, think that if we have another form like a new post form, that form would also be managed by a separate form group. Each input field in that form would have its own instances of form control. So I hope that makes sense. And guys, one more thing, don't get confused with this form control and this form group with CSS classes like form group and form control. Here we are talking about TypeScript classes provided by Angular. So remember this, okay? Alright, so as I mentioned earlier, form control is a TypeScript class. So this class has several useful properties that can help with form validation, such as value, dirty, pristine, valid, and errors. To access these properties, we need to create a new instance of the form control class. So how do we do that? Can you guys tell me? If you guys can remember, when we're dealing with the Angular services, I told you that in order to use an Angular service, we have to create a new instance of that service class inside the component class. For this, we use two approaches. So we use the JavaScript or the TypeScript new keyword, and also we use the dependency injection approach. So same like this, in order to access the form group class, we have to create the new instance of that class, right? So for this guys, in Angular, we have two approaches to creating these class instances. So the first one is the manual approach. So we can manually create an instance of the form group by writing the relevant codes. The second approach is the template driven approach. So we can simply use an Angular directive within the template to automatically create the form group instance, right? Remember when I mentioned earlier that Angular has two types of forms, reactive forms and the template driven forms. So these two approaches align with those form types. The manual creation of the form group and the form control instances is what we call the reactive form approach. So on the other hand, when we create a form group or a form control using directives in the template, we call this template driven form approach. So guys, in this section we are focusing on the template driven forms, right? Alright, so guys, this is what a template driven form does. It primarily handles form setup and validations within the HTML template using Angular directives. So as I mentioned earlier, when we use the NgForm directive, it creates the new instance of the form group class. So that's why we got this entire form group class within this NgForm. So now using this, we can access properties like valid, dirty and pristine, because these properties belongs to the form control class, which Angular has instantiated for us using the NgForm directives. So guys, now you might be wondering what each of these properties does. Don't worry, we'll dive into these in detail in the upcoming sections. Alright guys, now we know how this NgForm works and what we can access with this NgForm. Now let's see, the first thing first, we have to get the form values to do the data manipulations. So how do we do that? So in the previous lecture, we logged this NgForm inside the browser console. So if you look at that, the form control instance carries the value property, which is linked to the input fields in our form. Right now, this value property is empty. That's because we have not entered anything in the input fields yet. So let's fill these inputs and click on the submit button. Again, we got another NgForm output log inside the browser. Inside this, now find the values property. Inside that, as you guys can see here, still this value property is empty. So why is that? Can you guys guess? So guys, in order to capture these input values, we have to create a new instance of the form control class. So we have to create new instance for each and every input that we have inside this form. So guys, this FormControl class also have the same properties like the previous FormGroup or the NgForm class, right? Let's see how to create these FormControl's new instance. To create this new instance of FormControl, we have two approaches, manually through coding or by using the Angular's directive. Since we are working with template-driven forms, we'll use the directive approach, right? So for FormGroup, we use the NgForm directive. So for FormControl, we have another special type of directive, which is the NgModel directive. So let's see this in action. So guys, all we have to do here is we have to add this NgModel directive to these inputs one by one. So let's add this NgModel directive inside this first input, add this to the second input, and at last add this to the address input as well. That's it. So now save this and go to the browser. As you guys can see here inside the browser console, we got this error saying that if NgModel is used within a form tag, we have to set the name attribute. So inside of our inputs, we don't have the name attributes. So guys, in the previous lecture, we added these name attributes, but for this lecture, I removed this purposely to teach you about this error. So guys, in order to work with this NgModel directive, we must add the name attribute. Otherwise, this won't work. Perfect. So alright guys, let's add the name attributes. Inside the first input, set this name attribute as name. Same as this, the next one is for email. So set this name as email. So next one is for the address. That's it guys. So save this all and go to the browser. As you guys can see here, this time we are not getting any errors. So now fill out this form and submit this form. Now as you guys can see here inside the NgForm value property, we got all the values of input fields within this form. So let's simply log only this value property. So inside the app component is file, simply add this, after this dot and value. That's it. So save this all and go to the browser again, fill this form and submit. Inside the console, this time we only got these input values. So guys, this is how we capture the form input values using the NgModel directive or the FormGroup class. Hope you guys got the idea.